Christopher Daggett is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation in Morristown, New Jersey. He's been a respected leader in New Jersey's nonprofit world for nearly 20 years, serving on a number of boards, including the Schuman Fund for New Jersey, the Regional Plan Association, and the Trust for Public Land. Previously, Chris served as Deputy Chief of Staff to the Governor of New Jersey, the Regional Administrator of the US EPA, and the Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Daggett.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning, everybody. Peter told me earlier, if we're all good today, or this morning, to turn the heat on for this afternoon session. It's cold in here, Peter. Oh, right. This is not a speech, not a sermon. So first, let me begin, if I may, by acknowledging, and I think it was referenced already about the fact that this is a kind of a difficult day because it's a mix of looking back and looking forward at the same time, but we ought to acknowledge all the people who died or who were injured, and those who are still displaced or otherwise still suffering from the impact of the storm. Many people have been through an awful lot in this past year, and I know in many respects that's why we're all here, not only for them, but for future citizens of the state. We also want to acknowledge all the people and nonprofits that work every day to help people throughout the recovery. Without them, we would not have made nearly as much progress as we have so far. So as I said, it's a time to look back. What I want to do today is simply list a number of observations to get us started to follow really the questions that Peter asked a couple of minutes ago. So let me begin with the first one, and that is, what have we accomplished? Certainly before the storm, evacuation actions took a lot of people out of harm's way and significantly diminished possible injury and loss of life. We should not minimize that effort because it really did make a big difference in the end, that people were largely out of harm's way. After the storm, we came together to provide relief for thousands of people led by local and state first responders, government employees, and nonprofit group members, many of whom set aside addressing extensive personal losses to help fellow citizens that were impacted. And in the immediate months following the storm, much of the most visible and unrecoverable debris was collected and disposed. With the American Red Cross, United Way, the Robin Hood Foundation, government agencies, and insurance companies focusing on relief efforts, many in the philanthropic community focused on intermediate and long-term recovery. Let me just give you two examples of that. The first was the New Jersey Recovery Fund that was really the brainchild and the quick action of Hans Decker, the president of the Community Foundation of New Jersey. Hans set it up almost immediately after the storm. Within 24 or 36 hours of the storm, he already set up the New Jersey Recovery Fund, and then we at Dodge put the first $1 million in to seed it to attract other philanthropic investments from around the country. And we had a number of foundations from around the country that didn't want to give necessarily to the immediate relief efforts of the Red Cross and United Way and others, but wanted to focus on the intermediate and long term and wanted to do it through the philanthropic window. And so they reached out and we reached out to them, they reached out to us, and they were supporters as well. And in the end, we raised about $7 million, a good part of which we have spent already toward three primary areas. One is the environment, focusing on policy, on restoring natural systems. The first thing we did actually is restore some of the beaches, help restore some of the beaches in Delaware Bay Shore that were vital for the migration of shorebirds, the Cominion cheer feeding on the horseshoe crab eggs that are laid in the sand shortly before their arrival. We also focused on planning, long-term land use planning, because it's been so important to figure out that balance between immediate relief and recovery and long-term planning for future storms and future significant disaster events. And then we focused also on media, primarily to follow the story, to follow the money, to make sure that people were aware of what was going on, and also to encourage civic engagement so that it didn't just become something from the top down, it became something that was engaged in by all citizens. How do we want to recover? Where do we want to recover? What should be the policies that we follow? And then finally, we focused on the arts. It's a signature area, as many of you know, for the Dodge Foundation. And we wanted to use the arts as a means of helping people recover mentally and spiritually from the event. Often overlooked in major disaster events is that strong psychological and social emotional impact that occurs with people. And so we focused on the arts as well. A second example is of the philanthropic work is the Rebuild by Design program. I don't know if many of you have followed it, but it's a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and area foundations to support an international competition to design resiliency projects for neighborhoods, individual communities, groups of communities, and urban and coastal shorelines. Yesterday, the 10 selected teams presented their initial findings both in New York City and here in New Jersey, and possible projects for consideration. From the cursory review I was able to make so far, I can assure you that there will be a number of projects deserving careful consideration for full funding and implementation. The process is that they presented those projects in a very general way yesterday. It will be narrowed down that each of the 10 design teams will select one project through their own work, plus some help from a panel of jurors that will help them review them. And then finally, they will take those individual projects into a full-blown design, the results of which will be announced next spring in April at the Regional Assembly of the Regional Plan Association. So the bottom line is, overall, that progress has been made in restoring the lives of citizens and communities, but we have a long way to go despite the rosy picture being painted too many times in press releases from Trent. In advance of today's first-year look-back, there have been a number of Sandy updates in the past week that have highlighted the slow pace of recovery and the disproportionate impact on middle and low-income homeowners and renters. There is indeed still much to be done. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned that many of our communities and towns are at great risk, either from their low-lying land base and/or infrastructure that is old and in a state of disrepair or in need of upgrading, and that risk is getting greater as sea levels rise. Weather patterns are changing and the water is rising. We have a duty, indeed, I believe we have a moral obligation to accept this and to respond accordingly. Pressure to put things back the way they were is great, but that needs to be balanced with risk assessments, cost-benefit analyses, and reality checks. Too many communities don't have the planning capacity and mechanisms in place to adequately assess and address these new and growing risks. We need to acknowledge that, we need to help them develop that capacity, and where necessary, we need state assistance, not just federal assistance. The state needs to take more of a leadership role in working with communities on interjurisdictional land use issues. Little to virtually nothing has been done to date in this regard. We simply cannot use home rule and all the issues of home rule that New Jersey is famous for to stop us from taking a look at cross-boundary issues that are so important, because, as we saw, nature doesn't look at boundaries when it comes ashore in storm events. So what haven't we learned? Sometimes I think we ought to look at what we seem to not have picked up. We haven't quite figured out yet how to balance the individual needs and those in the community at large. There are many competing interests, and it's awfully difficult to make choices. But we can't shy away from these issues, or worse, ignore them. Seabright Rising is an example of how it might be able to be done. It was started by linking individuals to one another. You've got a problem, somebody else has a problem, there's similar problems, start working together. Don't just rely on government to come in and help you out. You've got to start to figure out how you can team up with your neighbors and others to do things. Individuals became groups. Groups became the entire community, and the community is now looking into possible merger with another municipality. So all the problems haven't been resolved, but the big picture is being considered in Seabright as individual needs are also being addressed. Secondly, sometimes I'm not sure we realize that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Short-term versus long-term decision-making will put more people and properties at risk and cost future generations billions of more dollars. Tim Dillingham of the American Littoral Society talks about it as generational change. This is not going to play out over the next couple of years, but over a generation or two, which is really hard. It's hard for people to be patient and to invest time and energy into sound, long-term decisions. And finally, sometimes I don't think we appreciate the importance of transparency in decision-making. It's healthy. It fosters coordination, collaboration, and the generation of new ideas. So what do we still need to do? First, we need to make sure that our recovery benefits everyone in New Jersey who is affected. Over the weekend and yesterday, we've seen reports from the Rutgers School of Public Affairs and Administration, and you'll hear a little bit more in a few minutes from Patrick Murray about Monmouth University's work that has shown that our poorest residents were the hardest hit by the storm, and that to date, they've received a disproportionately small share of the amount of federal and state recovery assistance. We need to press state and federal officials to pay much closer attention to issues of equity. We need to include Cumberland County in the list of counties eligible for federal assistance. And if that's not possible, the state needs to step up in a much more robust manner. I think many of you saw the excellent story just over the weekend in the Star Ledger about the devastation that occurred on the Delaware Bay shore. If the devastation along the Delaware Bay shore does not meet the threshold for disaster relief, then frankly we need to change the definition to change that threshold. Cumberland County needs to be considered. Make sure that we're planning and rebuilding in ways that advance the concepts of sustainability and resiliency. There was a real sense of holding our breath when the threatened nor'easter was heading our way a few weeks back, and a sigh of relief when it passed most of the state without living up to predictions. That kind of activity, or that kind of action, is not long-term preparedness. It's whistling in the dark. We need to invest in green infrastructure when possible, and in upgrading and repairing our aging, in-place infrastructure to make it more resilient to future storms. We've avoided these investments for years and should use this recovery to make significant new progress. We need to consider a coastal commission. We need to revisit the work that was started by Tom Kane in that regard in the late 1980s. And if we can't get there, we need to at least encourage coordination and collaboration among municipalities. We just simply can't ignore the fact that development in one town can have impacts on neighboring towns. In short, we need to define and continuously advocate for what a good recovery would look like. There has been far too little attention paid to looking at the big picture issues of sustainability and resilience along the Jersey Shore and in inland communities. What progress do we want to make over the next 3, 5, and 10 years? We need courage and patience to lead us through the changes that require us to think and act differently so that we don't find ourselves in harm's way all over again when, not if, but when the next storm hits. Otherwise, we're going to be faced with new and increased losses and the fair questioning by taxpayers across the country about who should pay for them. We need to inform and engage citizens in all aspects of the recovery. We need to support good local and statewide reporting of progress and the tracking of public expenditures, and we need to include citizens in the process of deciding how and where government money will be spent. The lack of transparency in decision-making to date has led to increased levels of frustration and anger as the unevenness of recovery is experienced by those most impacted by the storm. It's one thing to make available on the state's website information after decisions have been made. It's another thing altogether to involve citizens in the decision-making process. Democracy is designed to be participatory, not exclusive. We must redouble our efforts to provide mental health services to those in need. At the New Jersey Recovery Fund, as I mentioned earlier, we've chosen to do it through the arts. But we also need to provide more individualized counseling and assistance to those who need them. This is particularly true on days like today, as voices silenced by the trauma of the storm are stirred again by anniversary dates and other reminders of the event. So we've made progress in this first year, despite government bureaucracy, insurance company intransigence, and the slow release of federal aid. However, we could have done so much more if there had been a greater degree of inclusion and collaboration by state officials. With the help provided by federal funding, we have all that we need in New Jersey to complete this recovery. We have vast resources and talent ready, willing, and able to assist and to lead. We have strong academic institutions researching, testing, modeling, and teaching. We have nonprofit organizations and all that they do to support individuals and communities statewide from relief through recovery and beyond. We have philanthropic support to assist those efforts and to raise issues that government leaders are reluctant to address. And we have smart, dedicated public officials and citizens with new ideas and a willingness to work hard and to learn from others across the country and beyond who have disaster recovery experience. It's all here. We just have to take greater advantage of it. With yesterday's announcement of another 1.4 or 1.5 billion in CDBG or Community Development Block Grant funding, we have another opportunity to do that, to make people come together and to finish this recovery. Let's take advantage of it. We owe it to ourselves and to future New Jerseyans. Thanks very much.